The situation in global media organizations like VOA, BBC, and CNN, the framing of African stories reflects the same trend. Editorial choices in these outlets often prioritize Western interests, focusing on issues of poverty, instability, and corruption. When African countries are covered, it's frequently in the context of crisis. Hello and welcome back to One Africa Show, where we have honest conversations about the future of Africa. I'm your host, Patrick Newman, and today we continue our vital series, A Seat at the Table, Africa's Struggle for Representation. This series sheds light on the barriers that prevent Africa from taking its rightful place in global decision-making and offers strategies to ensure that Africa's voice is heard and respected worldwide. But before we dive into today's powerful topic, I want to remind you to subscribe, like. Your engagement helps spread these important conversations across the world. And don't forget to stay tuned for the release of our upcoming book, A Seat at the Table, Africa's Struggle for Representation, where we delve deeper into the issues we're addressing here. So, make sure you're part of this journey and support Africa's path to empowerment. Today in Chapter 6, I'll be sharing firsthand experiences from my time working within global institutions like the United Nations, UN, and Voice of America, VOA. These experiences have shaped my understanding of the complexities, biases, and challenges that African nations face in advocating for their interests on the international stage. And while these institutions are outwardly committed to inclusivity and impartiality, I've seen firsthand how they often reinforce Western dominance in both global governance and media narratives. Let me start by saying that my journey within these institutions has been both enlightening and at times frustrating. On one hand, my time with the UN gave me a front row seat to the intricacies of global policymaking and the diplomatic processes that drive international relations. But on the other hand, I quickly realized that Africa's concerns were often diluted in bureaucratic negotiations or dismissed outright in favor of geopolitical interests from major powers. This frustration was also evident during my time at VOA, one of the largest international broadcasters in the world. While VOA plays a vital role in providing news and information globally, editorial decisions often reflected the priorities of the U.S. government and Western perspectives on world affairs. As a result, Africa's representation in global media was limited to crisis reporting, where poverty, conflict, and corruption dominated the narrative. Progress, resilience, and innovation, aspects that define the African experience, rarely made it to the front pages. This experience at the UN and VOA gave me deep insights into how Africa is perceived in decision-making spaces. In international institutions, the overarching view of Africa is often one of dependency rather than agency. The continent is constantly framed as a region in perpetual need of aid, intervention, and external governance. This perception, unfortunately, is deeply rooted in the historical power dynamics that have shaped global governance and media narratives. And what's worse, this narrative is perpetuated by the disproportionate influence that Western countries continue to wield in these institutions. One of the most glaring issues is Africa's representation in key global institutions. For instance, the UN Security Council is one of the most influential decision-making bodies in the world, and yet Africa holds no permanent seat, despite being home to over 1.4 billion people and facing numerous security challenges. When decisions are made that directly impact African nations. They are often made without African voices at the table. This systemic exclusion reinforces the idea that Africa is acted upon rather than an active participant in the decision-making process. At the UN, discussions on Africa-related issues are frequently dominated by representatives from Western nations. Despite their best intentions, these representatives often lack the lived experiences and the contextual understanding that are necessary for developing solutions that genuinely benefit African nations. While African diplomats and representatives work tirelessly to shift these narratives, their efforts are often met with institutional inertia and political resistance. It's a frustrating cycle where the same narratives and dynamics persist, despite the growing recognition of Africa's potential. The situation in global media organizations like VOA, BBC, and CNN mirrors this larger issue. The framing of African stories reflects the same trend. Editorial choices in these outlets often prioritize Western interests, focusing on issues of poverty, instability, and corruption. When African countries are covered, it's frequently in the context of crisis. And while it's crucial to report on challenges, the constant focus on negative portrayals contributes to a skewed perception of Africa as a continent always in need of external solutions, rather than a continent capable of solving its own problems. The result? A distorted image of Africa that influences global policy, investment decisions, and public attitudes, ultimately affecting Africa's ability to shape its own destiny on the world stage. As I mentioned earlier, advocating for Africa within these institutions is an uphill battle, and I've personally faced a few significant challenges. 1. Institutional bureaucracy and resistance to change. In large organizations like the UN, bureaucratic inefficiencies are pervasive, decision-making processes are slow, and reforms often face resistance from entrenched interests. Proposals for increased African representation or for a shift in the narrative on Africa often get bogged down by layers of political negotiations and institutional inertia. 2. Funding and influence. Many African countries continue to rely on financial aid and support from Western donors, which can limit their negotiating power in international forums. This economic dependency compromises the ability of African representatives to assert independent policy positions. Similarly, in the media space, African news agencies struggle to compete with the vast financial resources of Western media outlets, which further marginalizes African perspectives. 3. The prevailing narrative of Africa as a problem. Perhaps the most difficult challenge is the deeply ingrained perception that Africa is a problem to be solved rather than a continent of solutions. This mindset is so pervasive that even well-meaning individuals within international institutions and media organizations subconsciously adopt it. Advocacy efforts, therefore, not only need to push for policy changes, but they also need to work on shifting mindsets that are deeply embedded in the global consciousness. 4th, limited African representation in leadership positions. Even within international institutions and global media organizations, African professionals are often underrepresented in leadership roles. Decision-making power is concentrated among individuals who may not fully grasp the nuances of African affairs. This lack of representation affects how policies are crafted and how stories are told. Despite these challenges, I've seen real opportunities for change. From my personal experiences, I know that while the system is flawed, it's not impossible to navigate. Here are some potential pathways forward. 1. Strengthening African-led institutions. One of the most effective ways to counter Africa's marginalization in international decision-making is by strengthening African-led institutions. The African Union, AU, the African Development Bank, AFDB, and regional organizations like ECOWAS and SADC must be empowered to take on greater roles in setting the agenda for the continent. Increased funding, institutional reforms, and strategic alliances will be key to their success. 2. Investing in African media and storytelling. Reclaiming Africa's narrative starts with investment in African-owned media platforms. By supporting Africa-based news networks, digital storytelling platforms, and documentary filmmaking, we can provide alternative perspectives that challenge dominant Western narratives and highlight Africa's progress, innovation, and resilience. 3. Increasing African representation in global institutions. There must be a concerted effort to increase African representation in leadership positions within the UN, IMF, World Bank, and major media organizations. This includes lobbying for permanent African seats in the UN Security Council and pushing for more African voices in editorial decisions at international media houses. 4th, encouraging African diaspora engagement. The African diaspora has a critical role to play in advocating for Africa's interests. Diasporans in influential positions can leverage their platforms and networks to amplify African voices and reclaim Africa's narrative on the global stage. 5. Promoting policy and media literacy. Educating African populations about how international institutions and global media operate can empower individuals and organizations to engage more effectively. Programs that enhance media literacy and policy literacy will provide African leaders and citizens the tools they need to navigate global diplomacy and understand international news coverage. In conclusion, my time working within the UN and VOA has provided me with invaluable insights into the challenges and potential for change in Africa's representation. While systemic barriers persist, Africa is not without agency. By strengthening African-led institutions, investing in independent media, increasing African representation in leadership roles, and empowering the diaspora, Africa can reclaim its voice on the global stage. It won't happen overnight, but with strategic engagement and persistent advocacy, Africa can shift from being a subject of global policymaking to becoming a leading force in shaping its own destiny. Thank you for joining me today on One Africa Show. Please subscribe, like, and share this video, and stay tuned for the release of our book, A Seat at the Table, Africa's Struggle for Representation. Together we can make sure Africa's voice is heard loud and clear across the world.